Canberra, 1974. A city of wide streets and whispered secrets. A place where post-war optimism hung thick in the air. Where crime was something you read about in papers from Sydney or Melbourne. A place where mothers didn't lock their doors. Where children played unsupervised until the streetlights flickered on. But on March 17th, that fragile illusion cracked. Mary Bertram, 54 years old, mother of 3, left her home on Limestone Avenue that Sunday evening. She wore a lemon-yellow dress with a white collar. Her handbag held a grocery list, a handkerchief, and a tube of lipstick. She told her husband, Arthur, she was walking to the shops. It was a 15-minute stroll she'd made 1,000 times. But this time she never came home. For days later, 2 surveyors hiking through the scrubland near Mount Ainslie found her. Naked, bruised, strangled with such force the coroner noted fractured cartilage in her throat. Her body, left like an afterthought in the dirt. No handbag, no shoes, no trace of the man who did this. The headlines called it Canberra's shame. Neighbors swapped theories over chain-link fences. Police scribbled notes in files that would later gather dust. But the truth? It slithered away, swallowed by the same bushland that hid Mary's body. Her killer was never caught, never named, never punished. This isn't just a story about a murder. It's about the lies a city tells itself to sleep at night, the way a community chooses to forget, and the woman who became a ghost in her own hometown. A footnote in a cold case file, a name etched only on a headstone. Mary Bertram left her house at 5:03 p.m. By 5:18, she'd vanished from every security camera, every witness's memory, every timeline that mattered. What happened in those 15 minutes? And why, 50 years later, does Canberra still refuse to remember? Let's go back, further back, to the Canberra of 1974, a city so quiet you could hear the gum trees sigh. Ainslie, Mary's suburb, was the picture of post-war Australian idealism. Freshly paved roads, Holden station wagons in driveways, the smell of lamb chops and rosemary drifting over backyard fences. Sundays here were sacred. Families washed cars. Kids raced bikes with playing cards clipped to the spokes, laughing as they pedaled toward dusk. Mary Bertram was part of this tapestry. A 54-year-old mother, practical and unassuming. That evening, she stood in her kitchen on Limestone Avenue, tugging on a beige cardigan over her floral dress. Her handbag held a list, bread, milk, a tin of Heinz spaghetti for her youngest, who'd been fussy at dinner. Arthur, her husband of 28 years, glanced up from his newspaper as she left. Back by 6, she promised. The screen door slapped shut behind her. What followed was a sequence of ordinary moments turned sinister. A neighbor waved to her from a porch. A dog barked halfway down the street. Mary passed the corner store, its sign flickering in the fading light. And then nothing. By 6:15 p.m., Arthur called the police. She's never late, he insisted. But the officer on duty shrugged. Wives wander off sometimes, mate. Check the pub. By midnight, the neighborhood was scouring storm drains and back alleys with flashlights. Men in cardigans, women in slippers, calling her name into the dark. The police chalked it up to marital drama, a domestic spat, they said. Because Canberra in 1974 didn't have murders. Not real ones. Not like this. The city's darkest crime up to that point? A stolen bicycle. But Mary Bertram wasn't hiding. She wasn't sipping sherry at a friend's house. She was out there somewhere in a Canberra that suddenly felt vast, and a city that had always measured danger in petty thefts and speeding tickets now faced an unspeakable truth. One of their own had vanished, and the clock was ticking. March 21st, 1974. A crisp autumn morning. 2 surveyors, men named Roy and Tom, were mapping terrain in the scrubland near Mount Ainslie, a patch of wilderness so rugged even kangaroos hesitated to tread there. Roy later told police he smelled it first, a sweet, metallic rot clinging to the air. Then they saw the branches, too neatly arranged, too deliberate. They brushed them aside. Mary Bertram lay on her back, staring at the sky, stripped naked, her floral dress, handbag, shoes gone. Purple-black bruises ringed her throat, a constellation of violence. Her body, left like rubbish in the dirt. When the detectives arrived, one vomited behind a gum tree. The other radioed headquarters and said, voice cracking, "We've got a homicide." The Canberra Times splashed the headline. Woman's body found in bush, crime of exceptional brutality. But behind closed doors, the speculation began. A butcher's knife sharpened on gossip. Was it random? Maybe a trucker passing through, spotting Mary alone on her walk. A crime of passion? Rumors swirled about a mystery man seen buying her coffee weeks earlier. Or did Mary, a woman who'd never taken a taxi in her life, accept a ride from the wrong stranger? The police had nothing. No murder weapon. No fingerprints. Just a single set of tire tracks near the scene, washed away by rain the next day. Mary's handbag, the one holding her lipstick, her grocery list, her life, vanished. A trophy, perhaps. Or proof. Her family identified her via a scar on her knee from a childhood fall. Arthur Bertram collapsed in the morgue, screaming, "Why her? Why my Mary?" until orderlies sedated him. Meanwhile, Canberra's detectives scribbled notes in shaky cursive already lost. How do you solve a crime when the bush itself seems to conspire against you? When every lead crumbles like dry eucalyptus leaves? What happens when a murder investigation begins with no clues, no motive, and no mercy? For Canberra's police in 1974, Mary Bertram's case was a labyrinth with no exit. Detectives retraced her final hours like archaeologists sifting through ash. They mapped her last known movements. A 15-minute walk from Limestone Avenue to the Ainsley shops. A route she'd taken every Sunday for a decade. But this time, somewhere between her kitchen door and the flickering neon of the milk bar, Mary Bertram stepped into a killer's shadow. The first break came from a witness, Mrs. Eleanor Green, a widow who'd been pruning roses in her front yard. She saw Mary pause near the corner of Ebden Street, arguing with a man in a gray work shirt. He was tall, she told police. Broad shoulders. Mary looked agitated. Not scared, but annoyed, like he'd said something daft. The man vanished when Mrs. Green turned to fetch her shears. By the time detectives canvassed the street, the description was useless. Tall, broad, gray shirt. In 1974 Canberra, that was half the male population. Then came the second lead, a blue sedan. Mr. Frank Willis, a retired postman, reported seeing a shifty-looking car circling Limestone Avenue that evening. Dark blue, maybe a Holden, he said. Driver wore a hat pulled low. Didn't belong here. But without a license plate or a clear view of the driver's face, the sedan became a ghost. Detectives tracked down every blue Holden in the ACT, 127 in total. All had alibis. All but one, owned by a mechanic who'd reported his car stolen the week prior. It was found abandoned in Queanbeyan, wiped clean of prints. Another dead end. Forensics offered little. The scrubland near Mount Ainsley had been trampled by surveyors, police, and journalists. Rain had eroded tire tracks and footprints. Mary's body showed no signs of sexual assault, no foreign hairs or fibers under her nails. The killer had left nothing but rage etched into her throat. Even the branches covering her were generic, eucalyptus and wattle, torn from the surrounding bush. But absence breeds speculation. Within days, rumors metastasized. At the Ainsley RSL Club, drinkers muttered that Mary had been seen months earlier at a Hume Highway truck stop, laughing with a slick-haired stranger. A librarian swore she'd borrowed books about divorce in the weeks before her death. And then there was Arthur. Poor broken Arthur. The husband always falls under suspicion, doesn't he? Detectives grilled him for hours. Did you argue that night? Was she unhappy? Who'd want to hurt her? Arthur, red-eyed and trembling, had no answers. Mary's sisters defended him. He adored her. But whispers followed him to the grocery store, to the pub, to Mary's graveside. The police files tell a story of desperation. Detectives interviewed Mary's co-workers at the Department of the Interior, where she'd typed memos for a decade. They found no enemies, no secret debts, no jealous colleagues. Her friends described a woman content with her small life. Sunday roasts, knitting club, grandchildren visits. Even the notion of an affair seemed absurd. Mary, her neighbor laughed. She thought Clio magazine was racy. Then, in June 1974, a glimmer of hope. A highway worker near Yass came forward, claiming he'd picked up a hitchhiker on the night of March 17th. A man covered in dirt, reeking of sweat and gin. He kept saying he'd messed up bad, the worker said. Paid me $20 to drive him to Goulburn. Never saw him again. Detectives combed Goulburn's pubs and flop houses. Nothing. The hitchhiker, if he existed, dissolved into myth. By 1975, the investigation was a corpse. The lead detective, Inspector Roy Callahan, retired with crippling ulcers. His successor, a young constable named Harris, admitted in a memo. No forensic evidence. No credible suspects. Proceeding is futile. Mary's case was shelved alongside botched burglaries and petty fraud. Another folder in a gray metal cabinet. But the questions festered. Why did the killer strip her naked? Was it humiliation? A ritual? And why leave her in the bush, a place so remote it suggested the murderer knew Canberra's terrain. Someone familiar, someone local. The media, initially ravenous, lost interest. The Canberra Times shifted its focus to a political scandal. True crime writers ignored Mary. No serial killer link, no salacious affair. Even her family stopped giving interviews. Arthur Bertram died in 1989, taking his grief to the grave. Mary's children, once vocal, now refused to speak publicly. "It's too painful," her eldest daughter told a reporter in 2003. She's been erased twice, once by the killer, again by time. Today, the case file is a relic. Pages yellowed, witness statements blurred by decades of humidity. The blue sedan, the man in the gray shirt, the hitchhiker, all reduced to footnotes in a story without an ending. But linger on one detail, Mary's handbag. It never surfaced. No pawnshop ever reported selling a worn leather clutch, with a tube of Tangy lipstick inside. Whoever killed Mary Bertram kept it. A trophy, a secret, a key to a lock that rusted shut 50 years ago. So we're left with this: a woman who lived quietly died violently and was buried by silence. A police force outmatched by the enormity of evil. And a city that chose to forget because remembering would mean admitting the unthinkable, that the monster wasn't a drifter or a trucker or a ghost. He was one of them. What if I told you Mary Bertram's killer is still out there? Not in a grave, not in a prison cell, but here in this world, breathing the same air as you and me. Decades have passed, but the question still haunts Canberra's shadows. Who murdered Mary? Armchair detectives, true crime forums, even retired cops, they've all clawed at the same theories. And each one leads to a deeper, darker hole: the drifter. A stranger in the night, the easiest answer is a stranger. A faceless monster passing through town. In 1974, the Hume Highway was an artery for truckers, drifters, and men running from something. Could one of them have spotted Mary, a middle-aged woman in a floral dress, and seen an easy target? In 2001, a retired detective named Hal Porter reignited this theory. He claimed a serial killer active in the 70s, Robert Red McNamara, matched the profile. McNamara, a trucker who hauled livestock between Sydney and Melbourne, was convicted in 1982 for the rape and murder of a hitchhiker near Goulburn. He died in prison in 1998, but Porter insisted Red's routes aligned with Mary's murder. He liked quiet women, Porter said in a now-deleted podcast interview. Women who wouldn't fight back. But there's a problem. McNamara's known victims were all in their 20s. Mary was 54, and Red's signature, posing bodies in crucifix poses, didn't match her crime scene. Still, the theory persists. Because it's comforting, isn't it? To blame a ghost, a man who can't answer, a killer already rotting in hell, the husband, the first suspect. Then there's Arthur Bertram, the grieving widower who outlived his wife by 15 years. In every murder case, the spouse is scrutinized, but Arthur's alibi was airtight, or so it seemed. He told police he'd been home all evening, waiting for Mary. Their neighbor, Mrs. Ida Fellows, backed him up. "I saw Arthur through the window at 6 p.m. He was pacing the living room, worried sick." But in 2017, a crime blogger uncovered a discrepancy. Mrs. Fellows had cataracts. Her vision was legally impaired. Could she really have seen Arthur pacing? Online sleuths pounced. They dissected Arthur's 1974 police interview, where he'd said, "Mary and I never fought." But Mary's sister Joan later admitted to a journalist. They argued about money. Arthur gambled. Nothing serious, but the darkest twist? Arthur died of a heart attack in 1989. His coffin was buried beside Mary's. If he had secrets, they're 6 feet under. But in the true crime underworld, doubt is a cancer. And it's still growing. The local devil, Canberra's boogeyman, every town has one, a name parents whisper to scare kids straight. In Canberra, it's Evan Gravedigger Marsh, a petty criminal who mowed lawns by day and robbed graves by night. Marsh was never charged with murder, but in 1995, his nephew told police Evan had bragged about shutting up a snobby Ainsley bitch in the 70s. Marsh died in a bar fight in 1998. When detectives reopened Mary's file in 2003, they found a chilling link. Marsh's sister lived 3 streets from the Bertrams. Could he have known Mary? Seen her? The nephew recanted his story in 2010, calling it beer talk. But true crime forums still dissect Marsh's mugshot. A gaunt face, ice-chip eyes. They ask, does he look like a man who'd strip a woman naked? Leave her in the bush like an animal? Maybe. But Marsh was a thief, not a killer. And without DNA, without a confession, he's just another ghost. The affair, a lover in the shadows, then there's the theory no one wants to say aloud. That Mary had a secret, a double life. In 2019, an anonymous post on Reddit claimed Mary frequented a Queanbeyan motel under a fake name. She'd meet a man in a suit, the user wrote. Paid in cash. The post was deleted within hours, but not before it spawned 1,000 YouTube deep dives. Could it be true? Mary's friends dismissed it as disgusting gossip. But the motel, the Riverside Inn, burned down in 1987. No records survive. Still, the rumor clings like a stain, because if Mary did have a lover, it changes everything. Was it a colleague? A politician? Someone with power to bury the truth? The answer might lie in a 1975 police memo buried in the case file. Interviewed male subject, name redacted, at Department of the Interior. Claims Mrs. Bertram seemed troubled weeks before death. Declined to elaborate. Who is that man? Retired? Dead? Another question swallowed by time. The crowning horror. A killer among them. But let's circle back to the unthinkable. The theory that chills Canberra to its core. Mary's killer never left. He stayed. He mowed his lawn. He attended her funeral. He watched Arthur crumble. He sipped beers at the Ainsley RSL, nodding along as friends cursed the monster who did this. In 1974, Canberra's population was 200,000. Tight-knit, trusting. DNA testing didn't exist. Security cameras were science fiction. A killer could have melted into the crowd, his guilt hidden behind a smile. Maybe he's still here, an old man now, grandkids on his knee. Or maybe he's dead, his sins buried with him. But consider this. In 2008, a construction crew renovating a Griffith home found a leather handbag stuffed inside a wall. Inside were a lipstick tube, a grocery list, and a photo of a young boy. The homeowner, a retired teacher, claimed he'd never seen it before. Police tested the bag for prints. Nothing. The lipstick? A 1970s brand called Tangy, Mary's favorite. But without DNA, they couldn't prove it was hers. The bag vanished into an evidence locker. Another dead end. Or was it? Because if that handbag was Mary's, it means her killer kept it. Hid it. Trophized it. And for 34 years, it festered inside a stranger's wall. A secret screaming to be heard. The truth that remains. So where does that leave us? With more questions than answers. With theories that twist and rot and resurrect every few years when a podcast or a Reddit thread pokes the wound. Mary's case is a hall of mirrors. Every reflection a lie, a half-truth, a desperate guess. But here's what we know for certain. On March 17, 1974, a woman walked out of her house and into a nightmare. Her killer exploited a time when forensics were guesswork, when police dismissed wives as runaways, when a city's pride mattered more than justice. Mary Bertram isn't just a cold case. She's a reckoning, a reminder that evil doesn't need shadows to hide. Sometimes broad daylight is enough. There's a peculiar cruelty in being forgotten. Mary Bertram's murder didn't just steal her life. It stole her story. No plaques mark the spot where she died. No vigils are held on the anniversary of her death. Even her headstone, weathered by 50 years of rain, bears only the faintest etchings of her name. Canberra didn't just fail Mary. It erased her. But why? The answer lies in the stories we tell ourselves to feel safe, and the truths we bury to keep those stories alive. The myth of the model city, to understand why Mary vanished twice, first from Limestone Avenue, then from history, you need to understand Canberra in 1974. This wasn't just a city, it was a symbol, a planned utopia carved from bushland to house politicians and public servants. Wide streets, neat gardens, a place where the worst crime was jaywalking. The National Capital Development Commission had one mandate: sell the dream of Australia's shining city. Mary's murder didn't fit the brochure. 3 months after her body was found, the Canberra Times ran a front-page feature titled, "Why Canberra is the Safest City on Earth." It boasted of low unemployment, pristine parks, and community spirit. Buried on page 17, a single paragraph about Mary's unsolved case. The message was clear. This wasn't a Canberra story. This was a glitch, a smudge on the lens, and glitches get edited out. The bureaucracy of forgetting. In 1975, the Australian Federal Police received a letter from Mary's sister, Joan. "When will you catch the bastard who did this?" she wrote. The response, filed alongside her letter, was a form memo. Case remains under active investigation. A lie. By then, the case file hadn't been opened in 8 months. But Canberra's erasure wasn't passive. It was policy. In 1976, the Department of the Interior, Mary's former employer, purged her personnel records. Colleagues were instructed not to discuss the case. When a junior clerk asked why, his supervisor snapped, "We're not a true crime circus. We're a government." Even the land where Mary died was sanitized. The scrub near Mount Ainslie became part of a scenic reserve in 1979. Picnic tables were installed, walking trails paved. Today, tourists photograph wild kangaroos where Mary's body once lay. No signs, no warnings, just sun-dappled bushland postcard ready. The victims we choose compare Mary's fate to other Australian crimes of the era. The Chamberlain case became a national obsession. The Beaumont children vanished into legend. But Mary, she was the wrong kind of victim. Middle-aged, unremarkable, a housewife with no scandalous secrets, at least none the media could exploit. In 1984, a documentary filmmaker pitched a project on Mary to the ABC. The network declined, stating, "Lacks broader social resonance." Translation: Dead suburban mothers don't sell ads. Meanwhile, the Canberra Rape Crisis Center, founded in 1982, never cited Mary's case in their advocacy. Too old, too white, too ordinary. But ordinary is the point, isn't it? Mary wasn't hiking alone at night. She wasn't hitchhiking. She was doing what women do every day, walking to the shops. Her death proved that safety is a myth, one upheld by luck, not locks. And Canberra couldn't risk that truth getting out. The family that fell apart, Mary's children, became collateral damage. Her eldest daughter, Helen, changed her surname in 1981. Bertram felt like a curse, she told a school friend. Her son, Michael, moved to Perth and never returned. When the Canberra Times tracked him down in 1999 for a "Where are they now?" "Peace," he said. "We're nobody. Leave us alone." The only person who kept searching was Joan, Mary's sister. Every year, on March 17th, she'd call the police station. "Any updates?" Always the same answer. "No, ma'am. Joan died in 2008. Her obituary listed her as a beloved aunt. But her nieces and nephews admit they hadn't spoken to her in years. Grief, it seems, is as isolating as crime. The Ghost in the Machine in 2010, historian Dr. Laura Finch published The Canberra Paradox, Crime in the Model City. She devoted 7 pages to Mary's case, calling it a litmus test for institutional shame. The book was ignored by mainstream media. At the National Library of Australia, the lone copy sits in the closed access section. You need permission to read it. But here's what Dr. Finch uncovered: missing evidence. A 1975 police report noted a blood-stained handkerchief found near Mary's body. By 1980, it had vanished from the evidence log. Media censorship. The Canberra Times killed a 1976 op-ed titled, "Who Failed Mary Bertram?" The author, a retired detective, was told it undermined civic morale. Political interference. Weeks after Mary's murder, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam's office quietly ordered all federal departments to avoid public comment on the case. Why the cover-up? Because 1974 was the year Canberra's population surpassed 200,000. The year the new Parliament House was approved. The year the city needed to prove it wasn't a backwater. Mary's murder threatened that narrative, so she was sacrificed on the altar of progress. The silence that speaks. Walk through Canberra today, and you'll find memorials to fallen soldiers, dead politicians, even a plaque for a dog that served in World War II. But Mary, nothing. In 2018, a local councillor proposed a small monument near Mount Ainslie. The motion was voted down 9-2. One councilman argued, "We can't commemorate every tragedy. But this isn't about every tragedy. It's about the ones that force us to stare into the abyss." Mary's case reminds us that monsters aren't just in alleys. They're in accounting departments, at PDA meetings, behind the wheels of blue Holdens. They're us. And that truth is too corrosive for a city built on bureaucracy and denial. The reckoning that never came. In 2021, a TikTok user posted a 60-second video about Mary. "Why don't we talk about her?" she asked. The comments flooded in. "Who? Never heard of her. Fake story." The video got 12 likes. But here's the bitter irony. Canberra's silence turned Mary into exactly what it feared, a stain on its reputation. True crime tourists now trek to Mount Ainslie, hoping to find the spot. Reddit threads dissect grainy photos of Arthur Bertram. Conspiracy theorists claim Mary was killed by a senator, a spy, a cult. The truth is worse. She was killed by indifference, by a city that chose its ego over a woman's humanity. Mary Bertram isn't forgotten because her case was unsolvable. She's forgotten because remembering her would mean admitting that Canberra, the safe, shiny political wonderland, was never real. It was a facade, and facades require sacrifice. The echo that remains, so what's left of Mary Bertram? A headstone, a police file number, a few paragraphs in dusty archives. But look closer. In 2017, a street artist painted a mural in Braddon, a woman in a yellow dress, fading into a wall of eucalyptus leaves. No name, no dates. The council painted over it within a week. In 2020, a librarian found a note tucked inside a donated copy of The Female Eunuch. Mary, I'm sorry we didn't fight for you. And every March, when the autumn wind sweeps through Mount Ainslie, the branches rustle the same way they did in 1974. A whisper, a plea, a truth too heavy for the dirt to hold. Let me tell you about ghosts. Not the kind that rattle chains or flicker in old hallways. The kind that live in manila folders and microfiche. The kind that whisper from police report margins. Look closer. Mary Bertram's case is one of those ghosts. Officially, it's still open. A yellowed file in a Canberra police storage room, wedged between a 1973 arson and an unsolved bakery burglary. But open doesn't mean alive. It means forgotten with permission. No DNA breakthroughs. No deathbed confessions. Just a single sentence scribbled on the file's cover in 2003. No further action recommended. Mary's children, now grandparents themselves, stopped asking for updates years ago. What's left to say? Her daughter told a constable in 2015. The world moved on. We didn't. So why dredge this up now? Why comb through archives choked with dust and denial? Because Mary Bertram was real. She fried lamb chops on Sundays. She hummed Doris Day songs while hanging laundry. She sewed her youngest daughter's wedding dress by hand, pricking her finger twice on the needle. She was more than a corpse in the bush, more than a cautionary tale. But time turns people into footnotes. The Canberra Times article about her murder? It's archived in the National Library, yes, but the microfilm is mislabeled under local interest. Gardening Tips, 1974. Her personnel file at the Department of the Interior? Digitized in 2010, then accidentally scrubbed in a server crash. Even her killer, if still alive, is likely dementia-riddled or buried. Yet here's what survives, a single photo. Not the grim crime scene shot, but a snapshot from 1972. Mary sits on a picnic blanket at Lake Burley Griffin, laughing as a gust of wind steals her sun hat. Her husband, Arthur, mid-eye roll, reaches to catch it. This is the Mary they buried. The Mary her grandchildren know only through stories that trail off into silence. We tell her story not for answers, but for acknowledgement. To say, you existed. You mattered. Your death was not a minor inconvenience to a city's reputation. True crime thrives on resolution. The handcuffed perp, the tearful confession. But Mary's story is the opposite. It's about the void, the questions that outlive the questioners, the justice system that shrugs. There's a term archivists use, benign neglect. It's what happens when documents aren't destroyed, just ignored, left to molder in basements until the ink fades and the pages crumble. That's Mary Bertram, a woman reduced to benign neglect, a ghost in the system, haunting only those who dare to dig. But dig we do, because someone somewhere knows. A deathbed confession stifled by shame. A grandson who finds a strange blue hat in his grandfather's attic. A nurse who hears an old man mutter, "I'm sorry about the woman in the yellow dress," before his heart monitor flatlines. These are the threads we clutch at, the ones that keep Mary's ghost restless. So let's end where we began, on a quiet street in 1974. A screen door slams, a woman walks into the twilight, and a city holds its breath, waiting for her to come home. She never does. But tonight, just for a moment, look up, past the headlines, past the politics, past the easy lies we tell ourselves about safety and justice. Somewhere out there, in the vast, star-scattered dark, Mary Bertram is still walking, still waiting, still demanding we see her.